And I was one side of this gorge and the guys were the other side. And while we'd been rigging, we'd been like watching these like crocodiles pop in and out of the water below us. And I was just finishing off rigging on this side. And suddenly like bullets like ricocheted off around me and this kind of like volley of gunfire broke out. And I like dove into this little crevice and there's like the bullets kind of ricocheting off. And then it kind of calmed down a little bit. But obviously, the initial thought is like, I'm being shot at here. I'm Megan Hine, wilderness guide, survivalist and founder of Psych Media Solutions. I was very fortunate that the outdoors was a huge part of my upbringing. My parents were both really into the outdoors. My dad was originally a geologist, my mum a geographer. So a lot of our family holidays were spent looking at rocks and fossil hunting and climbing and exploring the mountains of the UK. I was very involved with the military cadets, where through that I got a lot of opportunities for adventurous training. But I had no idea that a career in adventure or outdoor leadership or TV consultancy existed at the time. Initially, my first love was the mountains. It was all about the mountains. I was absolutely obsessed with it. I was a really keen climber and I would spend every free moment I had on the rocks, climbing and exploring and mountaineering. And then I got involved with bushcraft. I happened to go to a talk that was given by a bushcraft company, and it made me realise that everything that I did up till that point was protecting myself from nature. I called myself an outdoor enthusiast, and I was interacting with the environment around me. But actually I was trying to conquer it as opposed to actually work in parallel with it. And this bushcraft just fascinated me, that it was just now much more like indigenous skills and traditional living skills and much more living with nature and working with nature and natural materials. So I ended up contacting this company after the talk, ended up doing an apprenticeship with them for 3 years, which is where I then started the expedition leading side of things, running very anthropological based expeditions, so going and spending time with indigenous peoples and then putting their skills into practice in jungles and deserts and remote areas around the globe. Although I had a kind of goals in mind, it was like my journey was not very linear and I had opportunities over here and then over there and I took them and I got to work with some absolutely incredible people, so jungle warfare specialists, Arctic specialists, high mountain guides, and got to learn from the best. I did a lot of youth expedition leading, ran an outdoor program in a school for 4 years, and in the summer holidays I was expedition leading. And at that point I was approached to help out with the stunt rigging for a little known presenter at the time called Bear Grylls. Like, it was the very start of his career with his Man vs Wild series. I think the first season nobody knew how big it was going to be, and it was a bunch of guys having a laugh, and there was a few things that kind of leaked out, and then they thought, well, we should probably take this a bit more seriously and bring in a team. So the second season I was asked on board to rig some of the stunts, the challenges, and stuck as part of his team for about 10 years. I was part of Bear's core team and moved into the kind of the creative side as well. So I'd be the first person out on the ground, or there'd be two of us out on the ground. We'd be scouting the locations and then putting the journeys that you see on screen together. And then once we started filming, I'd then be running the safety on those. And now, with Psych Media Solutions, which is the company that I founded, we now cater to much larger productions. Now we're looking after 350 people in the field, in the jungle. It's fun, it's exciting, but there's a huge amount of responsibility as well. So early on in the film industry, when I first started doing adventure survival shows, it wasn't as big scale as it is now. There wasn't really any other productions doing the same kind of filming that we were doing, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We were making it up as we went along. Although my original job was to rig the ropes and figure out like the systems for that, and at the time we were hiding a lot of ropes because there wasn't the budgets and all the technology really to be able to paint out the rope systems and hide them. So we were all having to do all this like kind of diversions of rope systems and things, which was super cool. It was so much fun. But as part of that job, and then kind of, I suppose they found out that I had the survival bushcrafty background as well, and they kind of tied that in, and then I was kind of doing the role of two people. It's cheaper for them. But we were doing some crazy stuff. You know, there wasn't quite the same animal protection stuff, which is fantastic. That's coming now. But, you know, I remember doing like dodgy dealings for armadillo and car parks and things. And going out and capturing like snakes like black mamba and feather lance and keeping them in a box. Like I would be going out and collecting these and then storing them in my room. And like I came back from shooting and like into the room, and these like the snakes had escaped out the box. Couldn't find them. I assumed that they'd just gone, but it was just kind of like tiptoeing around the room, like and looking into beds and stuff. But like looking back on it now, I'm like, I don't know how we got away with it, because I've only been bitten by a snake once. It was a non-venomous one, but it struck so fast. I was like, oh my goodness, like how we never had a serious incident. In hindsight, I don't know. But we always look at the hard skills, like the qualifications, the rope skills, you know, the medical skills, all of that. But what we often forget to look at and put as part of that package as well is the soft skills that we develop, or you develop and you need to be able to lead, and particularly big teams in these environments. So things like empathy, adaptability, and the ability to be able to resonate and connect with people. Because when you're really remote and you're responsible for people's lives, you have to be in a position where you have the ultimate say in any decision that's made around safety. And you have to be able to motivate people to keep going when the conditions are really tough. You have to be able to relate to them on an emotional level. But a huge part of the work that I do is risk mitigation. So it's always thinking ahead and planning and pre-planning and going through all the worst case scenarios of what could possibly go wrong, and making sure we put into place as much as possible, like this safety net, if you like, underneath a production or an expedition. So if something goes wrong, or when things change, which they always do on expedition, just like life, it never goes to plan, there's a net there to catch you that you can move forwards with. There's definitely environmental, political situations that are so far out of our control or knowledge that we've run into those. Back in 2017, there was a drought in Kenya. It was very, very dry out there, and there was a lot of illegal movement of livestock, particularly cattle and goats, desperately trying to find water. And there was big, like truckloads of animals being brought over the border and taken out. And we happened to be filming out there at the time. And I was rigging in a gorge. I was rigging like a rope bridge with two of my male colleagues, and I was one side of this gorge and the guys were the other side. And while we've been rigging, we've been like watching these like crocodiles pop in and out of the water below us. And I was just finishing off rigging on this side, and suddenly like bullets like ricocheted off around me, and this kind of like volley of gunfire broke out. And I like dove into this little crevice, and there's like the bullets kind of ricocheting off, and then it kind of calmed down a little bit. Obviously, you know, the initial thought is like, I'm being shot at here. So when it kind of died down a little bit, and I was able to get out, slide down the cliff through this water, desperately thinking, please don't eat me, to the crocodiles, and then climbing up, soaking wet, climbing up the other side of this, on this cliff, to a cave where the two guys were sheltered in. And we spent probably about 15 minutes in this cave waiting for the gunfire to kind of calm down, where we then were able to get off downriver and back to the Land Cruiser that we'd got parked off in the bush. It turned out afterwards it got nothing to do with us. It was just unfortunate. One tribe had stolen a load of goats from another tribe, and they tracked them down. Meanwhile, local ranger unit had placed an ambush. So we were like right in the middle of three parties that were shooting at each other. So yeah, it was quite exciting, but completely out of our knowledge at that time. And these things just happen. So it's really important in those situations that I'm able to control my emotions to some extent. Now, I'm incredibly fascinated with psychology, particularly around the psychology and the evolution of the stress response and how that's triggered in us. And if we think about the brain, to massively simplify it, we can separate it out into two parts. So you've got this very primitive part that evolved way before humans existed, pre-language, pre-humans, pre-mammals, dating way back. And it hasn't really evolved a huge amount over the years. The second part is what I think of more as like the human part of the brain, which is logic, reasoning. That's where your decision making comes from. But that primitive part of the brain is so powerful that whenever, like, if somebody jumps out on you and you get that, like, that, like, kind of, that primitive part of the brain is being triggered. It's the fight, flight, freeze response. And it's very, very powerful, and it's much quicker than the human part of the brain. So what I need to do in that situation is shut that primitive reaction down and get myself into logic and reasoning as soon as possible. Because when I'm responsible for the lives of other people, I can't be operating in the stress response. Otherwise, that's anxiety, that's fear, and those are overwhelming and they tend to take control. So I need to get myself into logic and reasoning very quickly so I can make like decisions on the fly. And it comes with practice. We're all capable of that. There's this assumption that you have to be like an adventurer or an explorer or, you know, ex-military to be able to do that. But we all have that capacity, and we've all got those capabilities, and we all employ them on a day-to-day basis. So, but in those situations, like, I need to be able to kind of shut it down immediately, so that I can then deal with the scenario that we've got there. And then it tends to be then later that evening, like once I've kind of calmed down, and, you know, I've finished focusing, that emotion then bubbles up. It tends to be once I've dealt with the situation, back in my tent, in my hammock for the night, and everybody's safe, and then that bubbles up. So, you know, maybe I cry in those situations, and then it's kind of, that's when you deal with it. Or that's when I then need to go for a run, go mountain biking, and kind of sweat it out. So something that I've been trialing recently in a way to be able to help understand mental health more, and the way that the fight, flight, freeze response and that stress response affects us, because it is an incredible system and it's very clever, it's very fast, but it's not clever enough to differentiate between a speeding car when you're trying to cross the road or that triggering Facebook post versus, you know, what it was designed for, which was to keep us safe from predation, so like the saber-toothed tiger or that bear, and it can't tell the difference. So it triggers in exactly the same way, which is a flood of hormones and chemicals through our bodies, which readies us to run away or to fight for our lives, or just to freeze and play dead. But that system's so primitive. And what we find in our everyday lives in this modern world that we've created, and bear in mind that this modern world hasn't existed that long really, and our brains haven't caught up with that the constant sensory overload that we deal with on a daily basis of like sounds, sights, smells, constantly hitting our brain puts us into a state of overwhelm. And many of us are chronically stimulated. And when that happens, then we're prone to autoimmune diseases, and most diseases now have been linked directly into stress. So cancers, Alzheimer's, dementia, all of this can be linked back to stress, and the way that stress affects us in lack of sleep and our nutritional uptake and all of this. So what we've been trialing, and this came off, I spent some time working with an anti-poaching course with anti-poaching rangers, and I was asked to help develop like a resilience program. So we looked at fear, and I was like, oh, how can I like trigger fear and anxiety in these people so that we can then talk through it and see if we can find a way of managing it, because they don't have the resources there to be able to deal with PTSD and the fallout of, you know, some of these individuals. They're absolutely incredible. They're facing, like, you know, firefights on a weekly basis with poachers. Not to mention like the risk from the wildlife as well. So how do we manage that? So we used height. And I think that's something that everybody can kind of relate to, that if you're standing on the edge of a cliff, you're going to feel the exposure. You're going to feel vertigo. You know, you're going to feel very unsafe on the edge of that cliff. It's not natural. Our bodies don't want to be there. They want to step back. So we used it on like a kind of a step build up kind of program over several weeks to help address it and to explain where fear comes from and anxiety and its purpose, so that they could better understand where it comes from and why it's triggered. And it got me thinking that actually this is something that could be applied to everyday life. So we started trialing programs with everyday people, for me particularly with women who tend to have so much on our plates. Just there's no way of balancing it, it's crazy. So trying to build all of that together and look at that stress response in women and how we can better learn to manage it, control it, or at least understand it. So yeah, we've been using the outdoors and exposure to the environment, to height, to water, to help trigger that, to be able to go through the process so they understand what it feels like. And then they're like, oh, actually, I feel this all the time. Okay, now how do we manage it? And even just that understanding leads to the acceptance that it's there. And that's enough a lot of the time for somebody to be able to, whenever they get triggered, to be like, this is that primal part. I don't need this anymore. This is my caveman part that's reacting to the environment. I don't need this. I can just shut that down. So courage to me is the decision to face the unknown and the ability to embrace vulnerability as a companion. And it's not the absence of fear, it's the ability to keep moving forwards despite that. Courage is often associated with adventure, with being active in these wild spaces, in the mountains, in the jungles, and overcoming hardship in the wilderness, which is true. But if I relate that to myself and the work that I do, I don't want to be working in a state where I'm out of my comfort zone because I'm responsible for people. On the film shoots that I do, I've got a lot of moving parts. I've got helicopters, I've got boats, I've got major A-list celebrities on set. I've got a whole host of moving parts. And if I'm in the fight, flight, freeze response, I can't focus and do my job. So for me, the work that I do day to day when I'm in the field is not courageous because I have spent a lot of time formally training, a lot of time of personal experience in those environments myself to be doing the job that I'm doing, which is why for me, courage is the everyday person. Every single day we make courageous decisions that have the potential of changing our lives, of changing our trajectory and shaping our future. So pre-COVID, I was away 10, 11 months of the year. And it's funny how we glorify that of at the time I was doing a lot of interviews. I had a lot of interest in my life. I was doing a little bit more in the media in front of camera. And it was always glorified, all this time I was spending away, bouncing from one environment to the next, different time zones, different environments, different peoples that I was working with all the time. And then COVID hit. And although I was still going away, there was more time between each of the stints that I was going away. And it made me realize how close to burnout I was. All my body systems, everything that had been glorified about being on the move and on the go all the time, was burning me out. And I also realized that for over a decade, I hadn't had any time really to reassess my values. I wasn't in my early 20s anymore. I'm going into the next phase of my life. And it gave me an opportunity to really think about my values and what was important to me. And I made some quite big changes and some very kind of difficult at the time for me decisions on where I wanted to go next. And something that was really important to me is team. And this is something that I've been quite unfortunate, I think, through the years of ending up with very quite odd team dynamics. It's quite a ruthless industry that I've worked in, and there's a lot of people that want your job and they'll do anything to take it. That pressure on top of the inherent risk and inherent stress of the work that I do is a bit too much, and I'm fed up of that. So for me, building a team and building something where we can be collaborative and we can work together and we can provide opportunities for other people that haven't necessarily had the same introductions to maybe the outdoors or adventure or filmmaking that I've been very fortunate to have. For the outdoors, for me personally, my gender was never an issue. Like me participating in climbing, biking, my gender was never a thing for me. I never even thought about it. But the work that I do, my gender is an issue, and that's why it needs to change, and it still is. Whether subconscious or not, that bias still exists, and it's time to change that. So I set up Psych Media Solutions, which is aimed at making the inaccessible accessible, capitalising on what we do best, which is being able to access very remote environments with small and large teams, but also giving us the opportunity to be able to develop new talent and just to be able to work as a team where there isn't any silliness. And it's so rewarding. It's so nice getting to that point. It's not easy, but it's so nice. And I'm very excited to see what happens next. If you think about the programs that you see on TV, if you think adventurer or survivalist, like who pops into your head? There's a specific genre of individual that pops up, but women aren't in that. If you think of an adventurer, it's not very likely that an image of a woman is going to pop up. And the media still hasn't caught up with that. So for over a decade that I've been working in TV, I was being pushed to be on screen, and I would always turn it down because it was never the right opportunity, because it was trying to bring Barbie to life in the outdoors, and that was never going to help women move forwards, because it would be more like, oh, see, women can't do this. So it's very important for me to be able to do that properly, and take only the opportunities that were true to my values and what I believe in, which has been very difficult, obviously, financially when you want to sell yourself out over the years. And I've been very fortunate to have those opportunities. It's not about targeting men. It really isn't. It is men that have given me the opportunity to be where I am today. It's all of those guys, like my father, my brother, like boyfriends, instructors, all of these incredible men that have lifted me up and allowed me and believed in me and given me the opportunities to enable me to be where I am today. Change is a very slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes exposure to something different for change to really happen. Different people doing the things that they love doing and they're passionate about, and this is where the parasocial media comes in, showing, like, our sons and daughters, women doing amazing things in the outdoor environment is going to change it. Like, exposing women to it and little girls to it isn't enough. It needs to be exposure of everybody, so it becomes normal to see different people operating in different environments or different career paths. I do think it's shifting. I don't believe that I will see the change that I would like within my lifetime. When I've had awful days, or I've been underestimated, or have lost out on opportunity because I don't fit in that box. But those days are fewer and further between than when I first started. And when I first started, I would be emotional when I was kind of crawling into my hotel bed or into my hammock at night, because I'd worked so much harder than my male colleagues and I was just exhausted. And we all know that you get a bit emotional when you're exhausted. So it is changing, and I am seeing the change for sure. And we just can't give up. We need to keep going, and we need to keep embracing that and providing opportunities for everybody. So to live courageously, we need to be able to embrace our vulnerability. That's to be able to sit in that fight, flight, freeze response, to be able to recognize it for what it is. It's a primal response that's trying to keep you safe. And then to be able to be like, okay, I'm scared, I'm anxious, that's okay, it's totally natural, I'm going into the unknown, and then embrace that unknown. The thing is, with fear and anxiety, is the body can't tell the difference between fear and anxiety or excitement. It's exactly the same chemical release in us. So maybe reshape it in your brain into, okay, I'm not afraid, I'm excited.